Hello guys, welcome back to another video today. Today we're back on the series of formal logic. There are some stuff I need to cover like sophisms and fallacies, which we are going to cover today. But basically this video is a blend both of the elements of logic by Joseph de Messier, one of the greatest scholastic philosophers of all time, because he actually influenced the modern revival of Thomism. He's a neo-scholastic, but also if you read a lot of Bertrand Russell's works, you'll probably see references to this guy in some point. J.D. Messier. They might reference him as J.D. Messier, but basically his epistemological writings and his psychology is very profound. All right, so this guy is no joke. But basically, let's get into the video. Okay, so you guys might have heard what a fallacy is. Now, sophism and fallacy here is going to be used interchangeably. So you could say a sophism or a fallacy, right? Now, usually textbooks define a fallacy as a mistaken reasoning. But in a more general sense, a fallacy is simply an argument or a demonstration that appears to be true. You can't even call it a demonstration because it's not, right? But it leads to a false conclusion. So this is a type of deception, hence the name sophism or sophist, right? Or deceiving can occur because of the ambiguity of a term or maybe some confusion within the argument. So ambiguity in the expressions could lead us to two fallacy. First, you have the equivocation fallacy or the ambiguous middle. And this happens when an argument uses the middle term in two different senses, thus saying it is used equivocally. Coppens gives the example: 1. The soul is immortal. 2. A brute animal has a soul. 3. Therefore, a brute animal has something immortal. So right off the bat, you could tell this argument is just fallacious. It's using soul in two different senses. First, the soul in the first premise is referring to human soul, which is immortal. And 2, the soul in animals are mortal, right? Because if you, in the general Aristotelian metaphysics, animals only have the vegetative soul, and I forgot the other one already, but humans have all three, and they have the rational soul, which is immortal. But basically, if you remember in scholastic disputation, to really critique an argument like this, all you have to do is say you distinguish the middle term, right? So you distinguish the premises on how it's used. So you could say, I distinguish the major premise. If you're talking about the human soul, I concede. If you're talking about the animal soul, I deny. And thus, 2, you could say you concede that. But basically, when this fallacy occurs, notice what happens to the nature of the syllogism. It destroys the syllogism, because whenever you equivocate on a term, you're creating two separate meanings. Meaning now you have two terms. Now you add that to the whole thing, you have 4 terms, which violates the rules of a syllogism, which is you cannot have more than 3 terms. So that is not really good. So don't equivocate, remember. 2, the second fallacy from ambiguity is the fallacy of composition and division, which is a little bit more tricky and confusing, which I'll get into the end. Now, the fallacy of composition really happens when someone just assumes that a characteristic of the parts of a whole must also be true of the whole itself. So the fallacy of division occurs when assuming what's true for the whole is true for each part. So take the claim, for example: it is absolutely impossible that the dead should live. This is true in the sense of composition, that is when we're talking about that, the dead can't both be dead and alive at the same time. But it's false in the sense of division, because, it's not entirely impossible, because it's also possible that God can make the dead alive again. Now, fallacies are the consequence from the confusion of thought, and these occur in 6 ways. So first, you get the fallacy of accident, which confuses an essential property with an accidental property. For example, if I say we buy raw meat, 2, we eat what we buy, hint, 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 look at the word what, right? Really, it's asking the quiddity. 3, therefore, we eat raw meat. Now, if you look at the nature of meat, raw, cooked is a merely accidental predicate of meat, right? But really, the question is, what we buy is actually asking an essential question. So the mistake is that we're saying we eat what. This indicates quiddity or essence. But when we say raw meat, we're indicating an accident. And this is why it's important to know the 5 predicables and, actually read isagoge, which I'm creating a whole series on, by the way. But yes, this is a fallacy because you're confusing something accidental for what is essential. Just because we eat what we buy doesn't mean we eat this accidental form of it, right? Oops, sorry, I skipped the slide. Alright, thus if it was formulated this way, we buy meat, we eat what we buy, therefore we eat meat. This is actually valid. This is valid. Notice that we eat has the same essence as what we buy. Alright, 2. A confusion of thought, secondly, arises when what is true in the proper sense of the word, simplicator, is often confused what is true in a qualified sense or under a certain respect, also known as secundum quid. This fallacy is also known as the famous, and you might see it all the time, hasty generalization fallacy, which is a sophism of induction, by the way. But note, simplicator here means just absolutely or unconditionally. For example, if you take the syllogism, whoever intentionally kills another person is guilty of murder, but a soldier intentionally kills enemies in battle, therefore the soldier is guilty of murder. The major premise is true simplicator only if we mean unlawful killing or unjustified killing. But in this case, the soldier only killed because of a certain condition, a lawful act of war, so it commits the fallacy or the secundum quid fallacy. But if you want to really critique it using, a little bit of disputatio, you could say, to the major, I distinguish the major premise. If you take it simplicator, meaning like if you mean unlawful killing or unjustified killing, I concede. But if you mean killing with intent to maybe perhaps protect one's country or fight for one's country, I deny. Second, you contradistinguish the minor premise, that is, but a soldier intentionally kills enemies in battle. You say, if you mean unlawful killing or unjustified killing, I deny. And if you mean if you mean killing in terms of trying to protect one's country or etc., I concede. Thus, that's what a contradistinguishing is. It's like you see the distinguish in major is contrary to the distinguishment in the minor, right? And thus you can deny the consequence. Alright, 3, we have what we call an irrelevant conclusion. It's also called ignoratio elenchi, or it's basically just missing the point. And this occurs when something proves not what is in question or refutes something that wasn't even objected. And I hope I don't even have to elaborate on this because it's pretty simple, right? This occurs sometimes, but it's rare. Fourth which is a common one. It's what we call petito principi. It's begging the question. So this occurs when someone assumes the very thing they're trying to prove. So, for example, it's like an empiricist trying to justify the validity of the senses using the senses. He's presupposing the thing already, or the most common example is the Bible is true because the Bible says so, which already presupposes the truth of the Bible, right? So in other words, instead of giving real reasons or evidence, they just restate the conclusion in a slightly different way as if it were already true. 5, the non sequitur, or the fallacy of false consequence. This is also a common one that people get to, you see online, get charged with. Right? That's a non sequitur that does not follow. So this occurs when a conclusion is drawn from which is not contained in a premises or from previous statements. In other words, it's just also called false consequence. You could say that in a syllogism. Sometimes it's used towards enthymemes or rhetorical demonstrations. You can always charge someone like, oh, that doesn't follow, and then you explain why it doesn't follow. Okay, and 6 is the post hoc fallacy. And this just occurs when someone assumes as a cause which is not a cause, or the logical form goes like this: X occurred, then Y occurred, therefore X caused Y. So it's basically alleging a causal connection based off of the events observed temporally. It just assumes that an event caused another just because it has a priority in time, which is a fallacy, right? Just because it is true that I saw a red light before I got sick, that doesn't mean that the red light caused my sickness, did it? No, right? So that's basically what it's doing, or what the fallacy is about. But overall, a fallacy is simply just a mistaken reasoning, okay? And if you want to check out more fallacies, check out the website Logically Fallacious. I also noted that in my last video on talking about indirect argument, the indirect argumentation, argumentum ad hominem, is not inherently a fallacy. It can be a fallacy, that is abusive ad hominem, but it's actually a way to argue indirectly. Okay, now some philosophers define a sophism as false reasoning with the intention of deceiving, that is current acceptation. Now, going to Messier, he talks about erroneous and sophistical arguments or false reasoning either stems from the basis, that is, you take from the doubtful or erroneous premises as true or certain, or you take it from the form, as drawing the conclusions that are not logically flowing from the premises, consciously or unconsciously. Thus, we have to distinguish. An erroneous argument is when false reasoning is from an incorrect basis. Paralogism is when you have false reasoning where one is self-deceived, and sophism is false reasoning with the intention of deceiving. And that's why, sophists always have a bad reputation, since the time of Socrates. Alright, now with Mill, yes, John Stuart Mill, sophisms can be divided into two classes. First of all, you got a priori sophisms, or sophisms of simple inspection. These are prejudices or maxims that are generally accepted without argument, to which no one doubts, but they're still erroneous, or at least they're, equivocal. There is also sophisms in reasoning, or are called sophisms of inference. Two, we have sophisms of induction. This includes sophisms of observation, sophism of interpretation, or inductive inference. So a sophism of observation is, for example, when somebody concludes that is outside the bounds of what they observed. And so maybe a good example is this, is that a lot of, scientists may observe something and then they just make these general, really real universal claims from maybe a really limited set of data that doesn't really justify the whole, universal claim. So scientists tend to make those leaps, and this is what we call sophism of observation. A sophism of interpretation is a false interpretation of objective facts or of observed facts. So, for example, a great example of this is, I'm pretty sure if you know in history, I think there's something called the study of skulls, but basically they observed that some people had smaller skulls and some people had bigger skulls or heads. And they reasoned that people with bigger heads or bigger skulls were generally more intelligent. And this is what something we would also call a sophism of observation or a sophism of interpretation, because it's misinterpreting or it's creating a false interpretation of observed facts, but it's also kind of it's a sophism with intent to deceive as well. Right, because that's how they justified colonization. Okay, alright, the sophism of inductive inference is crucial because this is where analogy gets abused. So, analogy is one way to argue inductively, right? We use analogies all the time. We use it in rhetorical arguments, right? Because it's real. Analogy examples are really strong, right? That's what Aristotle noted in rhetoric, right? And you shouldn't always use a syllogism because an enthymeme is really strong for a rhetorical demonstration, or can be. But basically, analogy can get abused when you have a false analogy. That is, when you allege one scenario similar to another scenario, but the way you're alleging it is not the same way. Right? It's not the same. So yeah. Okay, so thus we could really recap or what Joseph Messier elaborates first. So we have sophisms of terms, equivocation. So this is obviously when we use the same word in two different senses or more senses, which creates a hidden fourth term, and this violates our syllogism. So boom, your argument's invalid. Fallacy of composition, assuming what is true of individual parts is true of the group as a whole, and then assuming what is true of the whole is true for all the individual parts. For example, each person in a group is strong, therefore the group is strong. That's a fallacy, right? All right, and 3, the fallacy of division, which is separate from the collective. This is when you're assuming what is true of the group as a whole is true of its individual parts. So, for example, if you say 5 is one number, 2 and 3 make 5, therefore 2 and 3 are one number. That's a fallacy. All right. And then 2, you have sophisms of induction or inference. And as I've already said, begging the question, petito principle, it's basically presupposing the thing you're already trying to prove, or your conclusion is already contained in one of your premises. Alright, and 2, we have vicious circle, which is circular reasoning. And this is also different because Petito principle is when the conclusion is already contained in the premises. A vicious circle is when you have two propositions are used to prove each other. And because Messier is a Thomist Catholic, he objects to Descartes, and he says, well, this, for example, Descartes proves God's veracity by the certainty of truth, and the certainty of truth by God's veracity. So basically what he's saying is that Descartes proves God's existence by assuming certain truths, and then he also tries to prove those certain truths, or the reliability of the external world and all these issues about external objects by God's truth, which is a fallacy. And also that's also known as the Cartesian circle, which has been charged by many philosophers for a long time. And then we already have what is sophism of accident, sophism of non-cause or false cause, that is the post hoc fallacy. And then we have the sophism of interrogation, also known as the complex question. So this happens when I question you and I presuppose. So the question assumes something. So for example, if I say, well, why did you steal from me? Notice the question presupposes that you stole from me. So it makes a hidden assumption, right? And this is a fallacy because it presupposes or assumes something first. And then lastly, obviously we have the ignoratio elenchi, and this really happens when there's just a misunderstanding. You're proving something that doesn't even relate to the issue. You prove too much, you prove too little, or you prove something that's just irrelevant to the actual question. It's also can be seen as a type of red herring, but it's not exactly the same. Right? And so that's basically it for sophisms and fallacies. Thanks for watching. Oh, and one more thing. Knowing all these fallacies will help you develop stronger arguments. Now, generally, typically today, especially in my school, I see a lot of people, they have good arguments. They have good, I guess you could say good evidence. So, for anybody in Lang or, English class, they teach you how to write an essay, a topic, sentence, evidence, and your commentary. Now, you need to be careful on when you elaborate on your evidence, because sometimes your evidence can be fallacious. It can fall into one of the sophisms of induction, right? When you're generalizing something that's too little, you're making a huge leap, or simply your evidence just commits a fallacy, right? And so it's really important to know these things and kind of stick to enthymemes or syllogisms, because demonstration will always be stronger than dialectic, or erroneous sophist arguments, because although dialectic is very appealing, right? Because dialectical propositions are one that are accepted from generally from people. Although you can appeal to a lot of people rhetorically, I think it's more important if you actually demonstrate your point logically using demonstration, right? I know a lot of what people say or teach you, or for your thesis statement might be like, well, don't state obvious things, okay? But in philosophy, nothing is really so ever obvious, everything could probably be questioned, and so mainly focus on demonstration. Dialectical propositions and dialectical arguments are great for dialogue, great for rhetoric, but not for demonstrations. Demonstrations require 100% certainty to prove your point. And that's basically what I wanted to say. So whenever you write an argument or a paper, make sure you keep these fallacies in mind so you do not commit a fallacy. Okay, and that's really important if you really want to argue for a paper, argue a position, right? Even if that position feels so obvious, like that eating too much is bad, right? But you can make it complex, right? You could use Aristotelian virtue ethics to justify that claim, right? Alright, that's basically it. Thank you guys for watching.